1, 2, 1, 2. Thank you. Well, a very good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much for coming to the presentation. As you can see from the title, the presentation is called the CTO Guide to Smooth Media Workflows. And it's a presentation that we're doing off the back of a white paper we produced, which is aimed at CTOs. And the idea is that we are trying to give some suggestions and some ideas about what can be done to make the workflows that you have in operation operate more smoothly and more completely, okay? What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the approach, and then I'm going to talk about something that's got absolutely nothing to do with media or audio-visual whatsoever. And then I'm going to come back to talk about audio and visual and broadcast with the intention of being able to show how the approach that they take in other industries can be applied to our own industries here to produce the kind of results that you think you'd like to achieve, but you've never really known how, okay? So that's the purpose of the presentation, is to give you some ideas about how that can be done. Some of you may be CTOs and some of you may work with CTOs. If I were to ask you the question, do you have the right technology to be able to deliver what your customers need today and in the future? My guess is you'd probably come across a range of different replies. Some CTOs would say, yes, we do have the right technology. Some would say, I used to have the right technology, but I don't anymore. Some might say, well, we're getting there, bit by bit. Some might even say, who sent you? You don't really know. It depends on the CTO and the circumstances they're in. But because of the changes that we're having in broadcast and audio-visual media in general, it's exceptionally difficult now to get a platform that meets all of your requirements. And you might ask yourself, why is it not so much more simple? Why can we not have just one provider or a series of providers that all work together to give us a system that gives us exactly what we want? And what I'd suggest to you is the reason that that's so difficult is something that those of you who have been project managers will have come across in the past. Because this triangle is something that's very, very familiar to project managers. It talks about time, cost, and quality. And what it says is, you can move around that triangle however you like, all right? You can have something in a short period of time and high quality, but you can't have it at low cost as well, right? You can have it low cost and you can have it high quality, but it's going to take a long time, okay? What people typically ask for is high quality and low cost and short time. But you as a CTO, you have to try and balance between those three things and find something that's going to be acceptable, meeting all the criteria. The point about the slide is that you can't have all three things at the same time because there are trade-offs that you have to think about. Now you may say, how does this apply to media? And the answer is it's not exactly the same because you're not doing specific one-off projects, but there are some analogies. And I think probably the most accurate analogy I can think of for this is to keep the low-cost thing at the top, to have functionality in another corner, and then in another corner have as an objective a small team of vendors. Typically, an organization doesn't want a huge number of vendors. It causes a lot of complication. It's difficult to manage. Your people are spread more and more thinly in terms of who they control and who they manage. So it's useful to have a smaller team of vendors. But the second part of that is, if you have a small group of vendors, the functionality they offer can be reduced because they don't all offer all of the functionality you would like, all right? So there's a bit of a trade-off down there, but of course also, as you go towards certain vendors, to add functionality in their standard platforms starts to get more and more costly. So the trade-off often CTOs have to make is, what do I want? Do I want more functionality and keeping my costs lower, in which case I'm going to have to manage a bigger group of vendors? Or do I really, really have as a priority, for example, adding functionality and keeping a small team of vendors, in which case my costs are probably going to rise, but I'm moving myself around that same triangle, okay? So this is the analogy that we have. Why is it not so simple for a CTO to just have one or two small platforms or big platforms that meet all the requirements? And the answer is this, because there are trade-offs. Now, another way to look at this is like a gearbox, all right? It's like having gears in a gearbox. If you imagine all of those gears to be a vendor or a platform or a specific part of your system, obviously with what's happening with with OTT and everything else, we're having to make that a much more complex picture. And as you add more and more cogwheels or gears into this picture, so it becomes more difficult to make it all work together, just as it would do if it were a gearbox in an engine, all right? So what happens is that as you're trying to build out these platforms, you end up getting a few missing gears, okay, a few missing cogwheels, and you also have some bad fits, okay? They don't fit exactly perfectly. The APIs that one vendor offers, they can be useful to you, but they don't do everything you need to do to keep it smooth, okay? So, the corollary of that is you need usually a few extra gears plus a little bit of oil. There's our same picture that we had before. Often you need to add maybe one, maybe two gears to make the whole thing complete. But of course also you need to put oil into the system, and that ensures that where there are areas where the fit isn't exactly right, you need to have a little bit of logic, in this analogy a little bit of oil, that helps those transitions between the different systems to work smoothly. All right? And if that all works properly, as soon as things are put in place and up and running, this is what you get, the smooth running gearbox, okay? So there's a kind of gearbox analogy for how getting completely smooth workflows actually has to happen. You can't have one vendor who gives you a complete solution for everything. You have to manage a number of vendors, and as soon as you're doing that, there has to be some sort of integration between them. Now, in terms of hierarchy, what that looks like in an organization is you can imagine that on the lowest level, you have platforms, systems. You know, like the vendors that you see around here, you might have Avid, you might have Evertz, you might have all of those people that provide platforms and components at a base level. And then above that, you'll have workflows. You have files that move, files that get transcoded, files that go into different systems. Those are all workflows. The coordination of all those workflows takes place with a process, okay? And a process is, in our terminology, is slightly more complex than a workflow because you have to take care of contingencies that aren't linear. A good example of this is subtitling. If you're working in post-production and you need subtitling from an external subtitle house or an external dubbing house, you have to send your file away, and your workflow stops then because somebody else is doing the work. When that work is finished, it comes back into your house and you carry on doing the workflows before. That more complex management is taking care of a process. And then of course, on top of that, usually you have what you call your business process management or your enterprise scale management system. And those are just the hierarchies. So when we're not even thinking about joining platforms together at a horizontal level, we are having to think about how we manage the whole thing in a coherent system at a vertical level, all right? So as a CTO, you have to think about that. You have to think about the BPM type systems that you're working into. You have to think about your own processes, your own workflows, as well as the technical details of integrating your platforms together. And that is a tough job. Okay, it's the people we talk to around the world and in different industries, it is a very, very tough job to get all that put together. So to try and make this presentation as useful as possible, what I've tried to do is take the experience we've had working with and talking to different CTOs in different organizations and give you some ways of thinking, some ideas about how it can be improved. And this is a picture, I'm sure some of you will recognize it, of McCarran Airport here in Las Vegas. And I imagine that the great majority of you here have actually passed through McCarran to get to this show, okay? Because to drive to Las Vegas or to take a bicycle to Las Vegas is not very practical for a great number of us. So that's McCarran Airport. And I'm going to use an aviation analogy in order to show you one of the principles about process management and managing towards continuous improvement. For those of you who travel a lot, you know that air travel can be a real pain, okay? It's uncomfortable, it's complicated, you get stranded, etc., etc. But there is a thing about air travel that's important, and air travel is incredibly safe, okay? It is an incredibly safe thing. For people who have fear of traveling in the air, they get shown statistics that say the great majority of flights that take place without any problem whatsoever. Air travel is incredibly reliable, okay? Now we do remember the times when we're late, and we do remember the times when we miss a connection, but for the complexity of what they're managing, it's an incredibly reliable system. And it is one of the best examples that we have of humanity getting involved in continuous improvement. And the reason, of course, for that is if it goes wrong, the consequences are absolutely tragic. I mean, completely and utterly tragic. So when something does go wrong in aviation, the amount of effort and coordination of intellect and analysis that goes into making sure it doesn't happen again is enormous. Okay, So I want to ask, does anybody recognize this aircraft that I have on the picture here? You do recognize it? It's Russian. It's actually not Russian. It looks Russian, but it isn't Russian. It's just old, okay? So it's actually an aircraft from the 1950s. It's a British aircraft. It's called a de Havilland Comet, all right? Now, this was the first commercial passenger airliner that went on a jet, first commercial jet airliner, all right? Now, there's something very, very important about the picture that I guess if you're not an aviation enthusiast, you're not going to pick up, okay? If somebody thinks they know what it is, please raise your hand and say what you think it is. Go on, sir. It's got square windows, exactly. If you take a close look at the picture, you'll see that the aircraft has square windows. How many aircraft these days do you fly in that have got square windows? And the answer is zip. And it's a really good job that they don't have square windows, because when these planes were flying across the Atlantic, they used to spontaneously explode. And that's really uncomfortable for passengers, okay? It's a big problem for customer services. It's a real challenge for the pilots. But when the plane literally explodes mid-air, it's an absolute tragedy, of course. And these comets, they began exploding all the time in mid-air. They were grounded. They stopped flying. This first commercial airliner stopped flying. And they began to investigate it. And it was complicated. They could not understand what the problem was. They investigated it many, many times over. And eventually they discovered, just as our friend here said, that the problem was the square windows, because they concentrate metal fatigue in the corners. The stress on the metal in the corner of the windows multiplies and causes tiny hairline fractures that are very difficult to detect. And then eventually, the whole infrastructure of the aircraft just disintegrates and the aircraft explodes mid-air, okay? So they fixed it. They put round windows on it and the aircraft stopped exploding. And aircraft don't explode mid-air really anymore. And it's because of this tragic mistake in the design that they were able to do that. This morning I went onto CNN.com, literally this morning, okay? And if you go on CNN.com, I imagine that unless something drastic has changed, you'll see something similar like this. Huge wins for Trump and Clinton. It's all about the New York primaries in the United States elections. But I did a little bit more digging on the website this morning, and I got to this little thing at the bottom. As you can see, there's a thing that says you should see this. We've got four examples. The unseen history of underwear. I promise you folks, this is not a plant. This is genuinely what is on the website today. India wants a diamond back. There's a kangaroo with a rifle with a couple. And there's a picture of the Hercules C-130, similar to the one that crashed in Afghanistan with the American Air Force, okay? US Air Force. The reason this is in the news is because they finished the investigation and discovered what the problem was. The aircraft took off and it went into a stall, and as soon as it went into a stall, it was unrecoverable for the pilot. It didn't have enough height to be able to recover it, and the aircraft crashed into the ground, and tragically 13 people were killed. According to the article, the cause of the crash was a goggles case, okay? The cause of the crash was a goggles case. Now, a goggles case cannot cause a crash because it's an inanimate object, okay? When you investigate an air accident, you can't have an inanimate object being the cause of the accident. Actually, what it was they think it's pilot error, because he left a goggles case in front of the yoke, and as the plane was climbing and the nose was going too high, he couldn't push the yoke forward in order to correct it. He couldn't correct the attitude of the aircraft, so it entered into a stall, didn't have any height to recover from it, and it crashed into the ground. Now, you might ask yourself, what a horrible coincidence, what a really, unfortunate thing. And the answer is no, no, no. It is not a horrible coincidence. And if it is pilot error, it is something that has happened before. And I know this because I've got a pilot's license. And when you take off, you have to go through a checklist. And one of the items on the checklist is free and maneuverable use of the yoke. And you have to physically do that on the yoke before you go into the runway to take off, okay? And he won't have done it. He won't have pushed it all the way forward and all the way back, because if he did, he would realize the goggles case was there and he had to take it out, okay? It was pilot error, a tragedy. But look how well they investigated it. Look how well they went into what had happened and what went wrong. And that is the point that I'm making with aviation, okay? When things go wrong, they do an incredibly good job of investigating what happened, finding out the root cause, and then doing something about it. And look how they don't make it someone's fault until it gets to the very, very, very last part, which is it must have been down to the pilot, okay? If you read these things, I understand they're quite morbid, but if you read them, they are excellent examples of a proper professional investigation. And that's what they do in the AIB, which is the UK investigation. Look how they do it. It's like the scientific method that those of us who are engineers study at university. You have a principle, you have a picture, a diagram of how things should be, an expectation. And then what happens is something happens that's different from what you expect. When that happens, they analyze what's gone on, and they look at the cause of it. And then finally, when they find out what's happened, they make some recommendations as to how to change that. And that's what makes aviation so safe. Okay? It's not just underlying technology. It's the fact that when something doesn't happen as it should do, it's actually investigated professionally. 100 years of development on an aircraft. This is what my father learned to fly on. He was in the RAF in the United Kingdom. And he learned to fly on this, a Tiger Moth, okay? And look what it is now. Look at that A380. That's the cockpit of an A380. And look at the difference in comparison. One of the most important things in the comparison between those two photographs is that the A380 has a huge amount of technology that's there to help the pilot. Okay? You can still fly the plane on his or her own, but there's a huge amount of technology to help the pilot. And it's not coincidence. It's been built over the course of the years on the basis of experience and what helps them to fly. So you ask yourself, Mike, we're here to do broadcast. Okay? We're not here to talk about aeroplanes, even though we might be excited like you are, Mike, about aeroplanes. We're not here to talk about aeroplanes. Why are you doing it? Why are you talking about it? Because in media, the causes of workflows that don't work smoothly are not as tragic, of course, as in aviation. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't apply the same thinking that we have in aviation to the way we manage media workflows, okay? And that is, just as I said before, we have a model of how it should work. We have the practicality of how it does work, and where there's a difference, we have to fix it, we have to close the gap. And the most difficult part is actually deciding the model of how it should work. Why? Because when you talk to a client necessarily has an overview of what's going on in his installation or her installation, okay? They have an overview, and this is an example of a QC and edit simplified workflow where basically you bring some media in, you do some quality control on it. If the quality control is okay, you authorize it. If it's not okay, you might want to edit it, and then you send it onwards. That's an overview, right? It's a simplified version of what you're doing. In practical terms, what does it do? Well, I'm going to show you an example of something I found on a desk in our office, okay? So I actually found this on the desk in our office a couple of weeks ago, scanned it, and brought it to you today. This is our developer, all right? This is our programmer. And this is how he sees the process. He sees the overall view, which is fine, understands the overall view, and then he has to actually say what needs to happen in all of these different steps to make sure that those high-level activities actually happen properly. And it's this rubber hits the road thing. It's this bit where it goes from the principle into the actual practice that's so difficult. It's difficult for us, it's difficult for clients, it's difficult for anyone who wants to take control of a process. But as we said in the aviation analogy, that is where the value is, doing that particular piece of work, okay? And then finally, what we would produce in our case, and other people have got different ways of doing this, is we produce what we call a state diagram, which is what are all the different things that it could be in. Some of you might know about this. What are all the different situations? Where can the file be? What could they be doing with it? What buttons could be pressed? And as a result of that, you build the logic that enables you to get a workflow. The thing I like most about this is when you have this mapped out and things don't happen as they should happen, you have a common reference, okay? And you can go to that common reference and you can say, look, it's not what we're expecting. And in our implementations, this has been an invaluable way of us getting closer to clients where they say, what you've produced is not what we require. And we say, well, look what we're doing. And they say, look, yes, we can see on the map that it's not exactly right. It needs to be different here. Then we can change that, change the programming, and the thing works better, okay? So that's basically and essentially how the whole thing works, okay? The analogy we had with aviation is that you have a picture, a model of how things work. Things go according to that model, and when they differ from that model, you have to investigate to see what the difference is. We've talked about gears and a gearbox in our analogy. I've cut my presentation a little bit short because the previous one ran over a little bit. But I'm just telling you now about two particular gears that we're working on in Mediamano, the extra gears in the gearbox. The first one is something that many of you will be aware of, and it's the necessity to turn audio into text, right? We have a very big client who ingests a huge amount of audio, and guess what? They have a load of people who watch the videos to see if they're interesting or not. Because they didn't produce them, they get them from somewhere else, and they have to actually watch them to see if they're interesting. You have an interview with somebody, how do you know if it's interesting or not if you don't have a transcription of what they said? And you think, yeah, it would be really difficult. You'd have to just sit down and watch it. So we've got a very, very interesting project going on that we've got some results from literally this morning that's to do with converting audio into text. And that text you can then put into, for example, Adobe Premiere, so that as the person is talking, what they're actually saying is appearing in words underneath. There are lots of interesting corollaries that come out of that, like the ability to look for keywords and then find those keywords within videos that you've got in your video repository. Okay, that's very interesting. The second thing we're working on is a very, 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 very interesting piece of work that is a little bit secret because I can't actually tell you what it is, but what I can tell you is the problem that it solves. And the problem that it solves is, if you think about it, how many different systems are in place today to move video from one point to another point? I'm not talking about consumers. We think a lot about consumers in this, like OTT platforms. But if you think about how many different ways are there for me as a professional video outfit to move video between myself and another person, there are loads of them, not just the file acceleration ones, but the people who do store and forwarding. The people who have their own websites where you download professional video from. There's no standardization of metadata. It's all a huge piecemeal thing. It's a massive piecemeal thing. There are so many different systems. Now, is that the case in IT? In IT, are there any products that might exist somewhere where you say, look, just download this software and you'll be able to share all this with me without any problem, and you control the permissions and everything else? And someone says, oh yeah, what about Dropbox? If I've got Dropbox on my PC, I put a file there and I can make sure it's shared with anybody around the world and they'll get it. And I thought to myself, shouldn't that be the case with professional video? Shouldn't it be the case if I've got a video clip and somebody else needs it, I should just put it into the system and say send it to that person and the system does it, and vice versa. And if I'm a group of stations and I've got one video to send to them all, shouldn't I be able to just do a one-to-many distribution? And if I've got people who are selling video, shouldn't I not just be able to go in and see it on a catalog, and if I want it, I download it? And shouldn't that all be controlled by permissions and groups like things are these days in IT? And the answer is, well, yes, of course it should be like that. But nobody's going to agree a standard to do it, are they? And every single vendor will say, yeah, well, we've already got that because that's my solution. So our next initiative that we're working on in Mediamano is Medianation, which is the costs should come down, shouldn't they? If we're all using the same system, the costs should come down. And so long as it's not me looking for that benefit, as long as I'm giving it back to you, then it will work. Ladies and gentlemen, I've done it in 27 minutes instead of 30. So we've cut forward a little bit of time. Any questions, I'd be delighted to take them. Oh, we have one at the back there with a lady.
I have a question about your deep listening thing. You see my accent or you hear my accent. How are you going to deal with that?
There is a huge amount of work being done today in the area of neural networks. Okay? Neural networks are networks in computers that simulate the mind. What a neural network does is it listens to a huge amount of people talking, and then it looks at what they've said by somebody who's pre-transcribed it,